In the flickering gaslight of a grand mansion that would one day be called the White House, a secret took root, one so profane, so impossible, that even the sharpest tongues of Washington dared not whisper it aloud. Thomas Jefferson, the revered architect of American liberty, the man who penned, "All men are created equal," harbored a shadow that contradicted every word he had ever written. For years, in the private quarters of Monticello and later in the highest office of the young nation, he shared an intimate bond with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who was, by blood, the half-sister of his late wife, Martha. In the sweltering summer of 1787, as the young United States grappled with its nascent constitution, a ship docked in the bustling port of Philadelphia, carrying a cargo that would forever alter the course of one man's life and the hidden undercurrents of American history. Among the passengers was Sally Hemings, a 14-year-old girl of mixed heritage, her skin a warm caramel that spoke of her African roots intertwined with the blood of English planters. She was no ordinary traveler. She was enslaved, property of Thomas Jefferson, the brilliant diplomat and future president who had summoned her across the Atlantic to serve as a companion to his daughter in Paris, where he resided as minister to France. But Sally was more than a servant. She was the half-sister of Jefferson's late wife, Martha, born from the illicit union between Martha's father, John Wales, and his enslaved concubine, Betty Hemings. This familial tie, buried beneath layers of societal denial and legal bondage, set the stage for a forbidden attraction that would defy the very principles Jefferson espoused in his writings on liberty and equality. Sally's arrival at Jefferson's elegant Hotel de Langeac in Paris marked the beginning of an impossible entanglement. The estate, with its manicured gardens and opulent salons, was a world away from the tobacco fields of Monticello in Virginia, where Sally had spent her childhood laboring under the watchful eyes of overseers. Now, thrust into the sophistication of Enlightenment-era France, she navigated a landscape of freedom's illusions. French law, unlike Virginia's brutal codes, did not recognize slavery on its soil, yet Jefferson, ever the pragmatist, ignored this technicality, keeping Sally in his household as an attendant. She tended to his youngest daughter, Polly, with a gentle touch, her quick wit and quiet grace catching the eye of the widower who had mourned Martha deeply for years. Jefferson, at 44, was a towering figure, tall, red-haired, with piercing blue eyes that held the fire of revolutionary ideals. He spent his days debating philosophy with luminaries like Lafayette and Condorcet, penning letters that shaped the destiny of nations, but in the evenings, solitude gnawed at him. It started innocently enough, or so the whispers of history suggest. Sally's resemblance to Martha was uncanny, the same delicate features, the same intelligent gaze that had once captivated Jefferson in his youth. As she moved through the household, sewing dresses or arranging flowers, their paths crossed more frequently than necessity demanded. Jefferson, a man of insatiable curiosity, began to engage her in conversation, teaching her fragments of French and sharing books from his vast library. Sally, though illiterate by formal standards, absorbed knowledge like a sponge, her mind sharp from years of observing the world from the margins. In those stolen moments, away from the prying eyes of servants and diplomats, a spark ignited, an attraction that transcended the master-slave dynamic, morphing into something perilously human. The air in the hotel grew thick with unspoken tension, a lingering glance across the dinner table, a brush of hands while passing a quill, each interaction laced with the thrill of the taboo. Yet, this budding connection was fraught with peril. The social barriers were insurmountable. Jefferson, a patrician from Virginia's elite, could never publicly acknowledge affection for an enslaved woman, especially one tied to his wife's lineage. Legal codes in America branded such unions as miscegenation, punishable by scorn, if not law. In France, where abolitionist sentiment simmered, exposure could tarnish Jefferson's reputation as a champion of human rights. He had drafted the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming all men created equal, yet here he was, ensnared by desire for a woman he owned as chattel. The irony chilled the soul. How could the architect of freedom justify this personal hypocrisy? Sally, too, navigated treacherous waters. At 16, during their time in Paris, she became pregnant with what historians believe was their first child, though it did not survive. This event crystallized the attraction into a secret relationship, one conducted in the shadows of opulent chambers, where whispers replaced declarations and passion warred with power imbalances. As months turned to years, the forbidden bond deepened. Jefferson promised Sally freedoms upon their return to America, emancipation for her future children, a life less burdened by servitude, in exchange for her companionship. She agreed, perhaps out of genuine affection, perhaps survival instinct, or a complex blend of both. Back at Monticello in 1789, with Jefferson ascending to Secretary of State under Washington, Sally resumed her role as a chambermaid, her presence a constant reminder of their Parisian intimacy. The estate's sprawling grounds, with hidden alcoves and winding paths, became their clandestine haven. Nights blurred into a routine of secrecy, Jefferson retiring to his study, Sally slipping in under cover of darkness, their encounters fueled by intellectual parity as much as physical longing. He confided in her about political machinations, the bitter feuds with Hamilton, the looming specter of war with Britain, finding in her a confidant unbound by the pretenses of high society. The attraction's power lay in its impossibility, a spine-chilling contradiction that mirrored the nation's own fractures. Jefferson's letters and diaries, meticulously edited by later generations, hint at turmoil, references to domestic attachments, and unexplained expenditures on fine clothing for Sally. Rumors swirled among the enslaved community at Monticello, passed in hushed tones during fieldwork or kitchen gatherings. Overseers noted Jefferson's unusual leniency toward her, allowing her light duties and private quarters. Yet, the outside world remained oblivious, shielded by Jefferson's towering stature. This unspoken pull evolved into a full-fledged relationship, birthing not just children but a legacy of concealed truths. Sally's youth and vulnerability clashed with Jefferson's authority, creating a dynamic where love, if it was love, was forever tainted by coercion. The chill deepened with each passing day, as the secret burrowed into the foundations of the presidential estate, waiting to unravel or be buried forever. Historians debate the nature of their bond. Was it consensual, exploitative, or something indefinable in between? DNA evidence in the late 20th century confirmed the paternity of at least one child, but the emotional landscape remains shrouded. In those early years, as Jefferson campaigned for the presidency in 1800, the attraction persisted, a ghost haunting the halls of power. Sally bore the weight silently, her enslaved status a perpetual barrier, yet her influence subtle and profound. She shaped his views on slavery, perhaps softening his rhetoric, though he never freed her in life. The forbidden nature amplified the spine-chilling aspect, a president to be entangled with his wife's enslaved sister, their attraction defying logic, law, and legacy. As the relationship took root, it set in motion a chain of events that would produce 6 children, each a living testament to the impossible secret. The estate buzzed with unacknowledged energy, the air thick with what could not be said. Jefferson's public persona as a beacon of enlightenment contrasted sharply with this private shadow, a duality that echoed the hypocrisies of a nation built on stolen land and labor. In the dim candlelight of Monticello's secluded birthing room, on a crisp December evening in 1790, Sally Hemings brought forth her first child, a boy, small and squalling, with a tuft of reddish hair that mirrored the father's unmistakable lineage. The labor had been arduous, attended only by a trusted midwife from among the enslaved, sworn to secrecy under threat of dire consequences. Thomas Jefferson paced the adjoining study, his quill idle for once, as the weight of impending fatherhood pressed upon him like the chains he so eloquently decried in his writings. This child, conceived in the afterglow of their Parisian interludes, represented not just new life but the crystallization of a deception that would entangle their lives for decades. Sally, exhausted yet fierce, cradled the infant to her breast, her dark eyes locking with Jefferson's as he entered the room, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, tenderness shadowed by guilt, affection tainted by the inescapable reality of power. The boy's arrival forced an immediate reckoning. In Virginia, where laws forbade interracial unions and enshrined slavery as an economic cornerstone, acknowledging paternity was unthinkable. Jefferson, already a prominent statesman serving as Secretary of State, could not risk the scandal that would dismantle his carefully cultivated image as the Sage of Liberty. Thus began the elaborate web of lies, spun with the precision of a diplomat negotiating treaties. The child was named Thomas, but in the plantation ledgers, he was recorded simply as Tom, a mulatto boy born to Sally Hemings, with no father listed, a deliberate omission that allowed plausible deniability. To the outside world, and even to many within Monticello's sprawling household, Tom was whispered to be the offspring of a fleeting encounter with another enslaved man, or perhaps an orphan taken in out of charity. Jefferson instructed his overseers to propagate this fiction, claiming the boy as a distant relative of Sally's family, adopted into the domestic fold to assist with light chores. This ruse extended to visitors. When dignitaries like James Madison or foreign envoys toured the estate, the child was kept out of sight or introduced vaguely as one of the Hemings lads, his fair skin attributed to the mixed heritage common among the enslaved at Monticello. As the deception deepened, so did Jefferson's internal turmoil. Nights found him alone in his alcove bed, grappling with a guilt that gnawed at his conscience like a persistent fever. He, who had drafted the words, "All men are created equal," now fathered a son doomed to bondage because of his mother's status. In private letters he never sent, Jefferson wrestled with the hypocrisy. How could he advocate for natural rights while denying them to his own blood? The guilt manifested in small acts of favoritism, providing Tom with finer clothing than other enslaved children, allowing him clandestine lessons in reading and carpentry, skills that hinted at a future beyond the fields. Yet these indulgences only amplified the risk. A keen-eyed guest might notice the boy's resemblance, the high forehead, the inquisitive blue eyes, and piece together the puzzle. Jefferson's dreams were haunted by visions of exposure, his legacy crumbling under the weight of personal frailty. He confided fragments of this anguish to Sally during their stolen moments, his voice low and trembling, but she met his confessions with a stoic resolve that both comforted and shamed him. Sally's quiet determination to protect her child at all costs became the anchor in this storm of secrecy. Born into slavery herself, she understood the perils intimately, the overseer's whip, the auction block's threat, the constant erosion of dignity. With Tom, she vowed silently to shield him from the worst, even if it meant perpetuating the lies that bound them all. She nursed him in hidden corners of the dependency buildings, away from prying eyes, and whispered stories of Paris's freedoms to him as lullabies, instilling a spark of hope amid the deception. When rumors began to stir among the enslaved community, murmurs of "master's boy" passed during water hauls or corn shuckings, Sally quelled them with sharp warnings, knowing that loose tongues could unravel everything. Her resolve hardened further when Jefferson's political rivals, sensing vulnerability, began subtle inquiries. A Federalist newspaperman in Philadelphia hinted at domestic irregularities in anonymous pamphlets, forcing Jefferson to double down on the facade. He arranged for Tom's adoption into the household's official records as a ward, complete with fabricated documents suggesting orphan status from a deceased relative in the Wales family line, Martha's kin. This deepening deception rippled outward, fracturing relationships within Monticello. Jefferson's daughters, Martha and Maria, sensed irregularities, the special treatment afforded to Sally and her child, but were too young or too loyal to question deeply. The enslaved staff, bound by their own survival instincts, participated reluctantly in the charade, some out of fear, others out of quiet resentment toward the master's double standards. As Tom grew, toddling through the gardens with a gait eerily similar to Jefferson's, the lies evolved. He was trained as a woodworker in the joinery shop, a position that kept him indoors and away from the brutal field labor, under the pretext of his delicate constitution. Sally watched him with a mother's vigilant eye, teaching him to navigate the invisible lines of race and status, to lower his gaze in the presence of whites while harboring the knowledge of his true heritage in secret. Her resolve was tested during a near miss in 1793, when a visiting cousin of Martha's remarked on the boy's features, prompting Jefferson to whisk Tom to a remote cabin for weeks. The incident intensified the web, with coded letters between Jefferson and his overseer ensuring the child's isolation during high-profile gatherings. Jefferson's guilt ebbed and flowed with his ambitions. As he eyed the presidency, the secret loomed larger, a specter that could derail his ascent. He poured his energies into politics as a distraction, drafting bills and debating in Congress, but returned to Monticello with a heaviness that only Sally could alleviate. Their encounters, now laced with the shared burden of parenthood, took on a new intimacy, conversations about Tom's future, promises of eventual freedom whispered in the dark. Yet Sally knew these vows were fragile. Virginia law required manumission papers, and public acknowledgement remained impossible. Her protection extended to emotional armor, steeling herself against the pain of loving a man who could never fully claim her or their son. As the years progressed, the birth of this first child marked not just a beginning but a descent into a labyrinth of falsehoods, where every glance, every favor, tightened the noose of secrecy. The spine-chilling reality settled in. This deception was no temporary veil but a lifelong shroud, binding father, mother, and child in a triangle of unspoken truths. With each passing day, the lies multiplied, like vines overtaking the estate's walls, concealing the impossible secret that threatened to expose the nation's founding contradictions. Tom, oblivious in his youth, played in the shadows of greatness, his existence a living embodiment of the deepening hypocrisy. Sally's resolve never wavered, a quiet force against the gathering storm, as Jefferson's guilt propelled him toward greater acts of concealment, ensuring the web's threads grew ever more intricate. As the years slipped into the new century, with Thomas Jefferson ascending to the presidency in 1801, the hidden family at Monticello grew steadily, each new birth adding layers to the precarious veil of secrecy. Sally Hemings, now in her late 20s, bore more children, Harriet in 1795, who lived only briefly, Beverly in 1798, an unnamed daughter in 1799, who also died young, another Harriet in 1801, Madison in 1805, and finally Eston in 1808, bringing the total to 6 surviving or recorded offspring, all conceived during Jefferson's documented presences at the estate. Their fair complexions and striking resemblances to the master, high foreheads, keen eyes, reddish hair, became impossible to ignore among the close-knit community of enslaved workers and household staff. Whispers that had once been confined to knowing glances now circulated more boldly in the kitchens, the fields, and the dependency buildings along Mulberry Row, where the Hemings family held privileged positions as domestic servants, artisans, and skilled laborers. The enslaved at Monticello formed a tight world of shared hardships and subtle rebellions, where information traveled swiftly through coded songs, nighttime gatherings, and overheard conversations. Rumors of master's children spread like wildfire, fueled by observations of Jefferson's unusual favoritism. Sally's light duties confined mostly to chamber work and sewing in private quarters, the children's access to education in reading and trades, far beyond what field hands received, fine clothing and indoor assignments that shielded them from the brutal sun and overseer's lash. Enslaved recollections later captured this undercurrent. One former Monticello worker, Israel Jefferson, would recount the open knowledge that Jefferson cohabited with Sally and fathered her brood, a sacred truth accepted without question in the quarters. Another, Madison Hemings himself, would describe the familial dynamic plainly in his own words decades later. These murmurs carried risk. A careless word to a white visitor or overseer could invite punishment, yet the truth was too evident to suppress entirely, creating an atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Outside the plantation's boundaries, political enemies sharpened their knives. Jefferson's presidency, marked by fierce partisan battles between Republicans and Federalists, provided fertile ground for scandal. Whispers of a concubine at Monticello had trickled through elite circles for years, but they erupted into public view in September 1802 when James Thompson Callender, a once allied journalist turned bitter foe after Jefferson denied him a postmaster appointment, unleashed a series of explosive articles in the Richmond Recorder. Callender named Sally explicitly as Jefferson's concubine, claiming she had borne him several children, including a son named Tom whose features bore a striking though sable resemblance to the president. The allegations, laced with racist venom, spread rapidly through Federalist newspapers, reprinted across the nation and even abroad, caricatured in vulgar poems and cartoons depicting Jefferson with a dark-skinned mistress. Political rivals seized the moment to assail his character, portraying the author of liberty as a hypocrite who preached equality while indulging in miscegenation. This public scrutiny struck like a thunderbolt, heightening the peril for everyone entangled in the secret. Jefferson, adhering to his lifelong policy of silence on personal attacks, issued no direct denial, allowing supporters to dismiss the charges as partisan slander while privately noting that sluices of calumny opened against him. Yet the exposure forced immediate precautions at Monticello. Children were kept further from visitors' eyes during tours and gatherings. Sally's movements restricted even more to the main house's hidden spaces. Records in Jefferson's farm book meticulously noted the births but omitted any paternal reference, listing them neutrally among slave inventories. A close call came when Federalist editors and pamphleteers probed deeper, hinting at sources within Virginia's planter class or disgruntled former associates, nearly unraveling the facade. One anonymous broadside circulated tales of domestic irregularities, prompting Jefferson to tighten oversight of correspondence and visitors, fearing a rival politician or ambitious journalist might infiltrate the estate for proof. The escalating risk transformed daily life into a minefield. Sally, bearing the brunt as both mother and enslaved woman, navigated with heightened caution, instructing her growing children in the art of deference and silence, lowered gazes, evasive answers, to white inquisitors. The older ones, like Beverly and Harriet, were trained in skilled trades, positioned indoors to minimize exposure, their light skin a double-edged sword that invited speculation yet allowed whispers of passing in the future. Jefferson's guilt, already profound, intensified amid the barrage. His letters betray distraction, expenditures on gifts and education for the Hemingses increasing as if to compensate for the looming threat. Political crises compounded the strain, the Louisiana Purchase debates, embargoes, and re-election campaigns, yet the scandal lingered, a persistent shadow that could erupt anew with any misstep. Stricter isolation became the rule, Sally and the younger children confined to less visible wings of the house, emerging only under cover, family interactions limited to nighttime or secluded moments in Jefferson's private apartments. The enslaved community, sensing the master's vulnerability, treaded carefully, loyalty mixed with resentment at the privileges afforded one family amid widespread suffering. A journalist's near-miss inquiry in 1804, probing Monticello's staff for confirmation, sent ripples of alarm. Jefferson dispatched trusted aides to quash leads, reinforcing the household's code of omerta. As the children multiplied, their resemblances grew undeniable, Eston's birth in particular echoing Jefferson's features so closely that even casual observers paused, pushing the deception to its limits. The air at the presidential retreats and Monticello alike grew heavier with dread, each new rumor or reprinted attack a reminder that the impossible secret teetered on exposure, threatening not just personal ruin but the fragile myth of the nation's enlightened founder. The tension coiled tighter, isolation deepening into a fortress of silence that preserved the truth only by burying it ever further from the light. As the presidency wore on and Monticello's halls echoed with the laughter of growing grandchildren, Martha Jefferson Randolph, the eldest daughter who had long served as the de facto mistress of her father's household, found herself increasingly attuned to the subtle rhythms of life on the mountain. She had returned from Paris as a young woman, married Thomas Mann Randolph Jr., and borne 11 children, many of whom now scampered through the gardens alongside the lighter-skinned offspring of Sally Hemings. Martha oversaw the domestic operations with a firm yet gracious hand, directing the enslaved staff, including her half-aunt Sally, who held a privileged position as chambermaid and seamstress, in the preparation of meals, linens, and entertainments for the constant stream of visitors. Yet beneath this orderly facade, irregularities began to prick at her awareness like thorns hidden in silk. The resemblances were the first to unsettle her. Beverly, the eldest surviving son, possessed a thoughtful gaze and slender build that echoed portraits of her father in his youth. Harriet, with her fair complexion and straight hair, moved with a poise that recalled family traits. Madison and Eston, the youngest, bore features so strikingly similar, high foreheads, keen eyes, a certain reddish tint in their hair, that even casual observers among the household paused in quiet speculation. Martha, who knew the plantation's ledgers intimately and tracked births with the precision required of a planter's daughter, noted how these children appeared only during her father's prolonged stays at Monticello, aligning suspiciously with his absences from Washington. Sally's quarters in the south wing, close to the main house yet discreet, allowed for private comings and goings that Martha, in her role as overseer, could not entirely ignore. Favors extended to Sally, lighter duties, finer materials for sewing, educational opportunities for her children that far exceeded those of other enslaved youths, raised quiet questions in Martha's mind. The 1802 scandal, with its vicious newspaper broadsides branding her father a hypocrite who kept a Congo harem and fathered children with dusky Sally, struck Martha like a personal betrayal. Though the attacks were partisan venom from James Callender and Federalist presses, they forced her to confront whispers that had circulated among neighbors and staff for years. Privately, she denied the reports vehemently to close confidants, insisting such a liaison was incompatible with her father's moral character and the practical demands of his life surrounded by family. Yet the seeds of doubt took root. She observed her father's unusual solicitude towards Sally's family, expenditures on clothing and lessons, the children's indoor assignments in trades like carpentry and weaving, their shielding from field labor. Irregularities in his nightly routines, late retreats to his cabinet, unexplained movements in the dependencies, coalesced into a pattern that gnawed at her loyalty. Martha's growing suspicion manifested in subtle ways: sharper instructions to staff regarding visitors' access to private areas, closer scrutiny of household accounts, a coolness in her interactions with Sally that masked deeper turmoil. She confided fragments of her unease to her own children, particularly Thomas Jefferson Randolph and Ellen, planting the family's later vehement denials. On her deathbed years later, the weight of it would compel her to summon grandsons and point to farm book records, arguing that her father had been absent for 15 months during the conception of the child who most resembled him, Eston, a claim intended to exonerate him but revealing how profoundly the resemblances and timing had haunted her. No record survives of a direct confrontation with her father. Jefferson's impenetrable reserve on personal matters and Martha's filial devotion likely prevented any explosive reckoning. Instead, suspicion simmered unspoken, a private agony that strained the bonds of affection without shattering them outright. The marriage to Thomas Mann Randolph, already fractured by his instabilities, absorbed some of this tension, but the core fracture lay within Monticello itself. Martha's role as hostess during presidential retreats amplified the dissonance, entertaining dignitaries while aware of the hidden family in the wings, their existence a silent rebuke to the enlightened ideals her father professed. She rationalized the privileges as charity toward a loyal attendant and her orphans, perhaps even attributing paternity to nephews like Peter or Samuel Carr, as her son would later claim. Yet the undeniable physical echoes persisted, chipping away at illusions. Sally, ever discreet and resolute, navigated this charged atmosphere with quiet dignity, protecting her children while fulfilling her duties under Martha's supervision, a supervision that grew watchful, tinged with unspoken accusation. This mounting awareness fractured the household's harmony in imperceptible ways. Grandchildren absorbed the undercurrents, later defending their grandfather's honor with stories of alternative fathers or impossible timelines. Jefferson, sensing the shift in his daughter's demeanor, her occasional withdrawn silences, probing glances, deepened his own veil of secrecy, confining interactions to coded gestures and nighttime seclusion. The suspicion never erupted into full revelation. Martha's love for her father and the catastrophic implications for his legacy held her back from direct challenge. Instead, it lingered as a chill in the air, a private torment that eroded trust and intimacy. The impossible secret held, precariously intact, but at the cost of a deepening rift within the family, Martha torn between devotion and doubt, overseeing a household where blood ties blurred into shadows, her father's contradictions reflected in the faces of children she could neither fully embrace nor entirely disown. The marriage of public virtue and private hypocrisy strained under the weight, threatening to crack the foundation of their shared life without ever fully breaking it. The twilight of Thomas Jefferson's life descended over Monticello in the summer of 1826, the impossible secret that had shadowed his every triumph and private moment pressed upon him with the weight of unfinished reckoning. Debts mounted like storm clouds, the plantation faltered under mismanagement, and his health ebbed with each passing day, feverish spells, painful rheumatism, and the slow betrayal of a once vigorous body. Confined increasingly to his bedchamber, the former president spent long hours in contemplation, surrounded by the books and instruments that had defined his enlightened mind, yet haunted by the living legacy he could never fully claim. 6 children born to Sally Hemings, Beverly, Harriet, Madison, Eston, and the 2 who had died young, now ranged from adolescents to adults, their lives shaped by the delicate freedoms he had quietly arranged. Beverly and Harriet had already slipped away into white society, passing, with his tacit permission and modest financial aid. Madison and Eston remained at Monticello, skilled in trades, awaiting the manumission that law and custom demanded be formalized only after his death. In these final months, Jefferson drafted and redrafted his will with meticulous care, freeing only a handful of enslaved individuals, his most trusted body servants and, crucially, the Hemings men who bore his blood, Beverly, Madison, and Eston, along with their uncle John Hemings. Sally herself was not formally emancipated in the document, a deliberate omission to avoid the explosive implications of acknowledging their bond. Instead, she was to be, given her time, an informal release that allowed her to live freely without the legal scrutiny that full manumission might invite. No mention was made of paternity, no public confession penned, no sealed letter addressed to posterity explaining the truth. He contemplated it, historians believe, moments when his quill hovered over paper, tempted to unburden his soul as he had once unburdened the colonies of tyranny. Friends and family noted his melancholy, his cryptic references to domestic happiness, and regrets unspoken, yet the architect of American liberty chose silence once more, preserving the myth of his moral purity even as death approached. The political crisis of his final years only sharpened the stakes. The Missouri Compromise debates had reignited national fury over slavery, with Jefferson himself warning in private letters that the issue rang like a fire bell in the night, awakening him with dread for the Union's future. His own contradictions loomed larger than ever, the men who had condemned the institution as a moral depravity, while profiting from it, who had fathered children he could not acknowledge without dismantling the racial order that underpinned his world. Exposure now, even on his deathbed, risked not just personal disgrace but a shattering of his revolutionary legacy, the Declaration's promise of equality rendered hollow by proof of his intimate hypocrisy. Rivals still circulated old scandals. A confession could arm abolitionists and sectionalists alike, fueling the very divisions he feared. Sally watched this slow unraveling with the quiet endurance that had defined her life. Now in her 50s, gray threading her hair, she tended to Jefferson in his illness with the same devotion she had shown in youth, moving between his bedside and the quarters where Madison and Eston waited for an uncertain future. She knew the promises whispered over decades, freedom for their children, protection from the auction block, rested on his final acts. Yet she also understood the boundaries of his courage. He would free them quietly, without fanfare or admission, leaving her and their offspring in perpetual limbo. No grand gesture, no public vindication of her role as more than chattel. Her children would carry the secret forward, some choosing to embrace their African heritage, others to vanish into whiteness, all marked by a heritage that could neither be fully claimed nor fully escaped. On July 4, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Declaration's adoption, Jefferson died, his last words a murmured inquiry about the date, as if clinging to the symbolism of the nation's birth. No deathbed revelation escaped his lips, no dramatic unsealing of truth. The will was executed with mechanical precision, the favored Hemingses freed, Sally allowed to leave Monticello unmolested, joining Madison in Charlottesville where she lived quietly until her own death in 1835. The estate itself fell into ruin, sold off to settle debts, the physical traces of their shared life scattered. Descendants dispersed, some preserving oral histories that insisted on the truth, others denying it to protect the Jefferson shrine that Monticello became. The final reckoning, then, was no cathartic unveiling but a deliberate burial. Jefferson chose the silence that had preserved his power in life, entrusting the secret to time and the fragile memories of those who had lived it. The 6 children and their mother entered history's margins, freed yet stigmatized, related by blood to greatness yet barred from its acknowledgement. Madison Hemings would speak plainly in 1873, recounting his parentage without bitterness. Eston's descendants would embrace the Jefferson line after DNA evidence in 1998 confirmed what enslaved voices had long asserted. But in 1826, as the sage of Monticello breathed his last, the impossible secret remained locked away, a haunting absence at the heart of America's founding narrative. The nation mourned its hero without knowing the full measure of his humanity, or its cost, leaving Sally and her children to carry the weight of a truth too dangerous to utter, their lives suspended forever between bondage and blood. The chill of that choice lingered through the centuries, a silent fracture in the Republic's soul that no confession ever fully mended.